When will planes take off for Rwanda? Is the taxpayer getting ripped off by private firms? And are falling house prices a good or bad thing? This is Politics Live. Joining me, the Conservative MP Stephen Hammond, the Liberal Democrat MP Wendy Chamberlain, journalist and author Paul Mason, and the Daily Mail's Inaya Falarin Imam. Today, the government's flagship Rwanda Bill clears the Commons.
The House of Commons has spoken, the Conservative Party has come together, the Rwanda Bill has passed.
So will planes soon be taking off for Rwanda?
I don't think it will work speedily. I think it is unlikely we will see flights going before an election.
Is this MP right to back her constituents over opposition to electricity pylons?
There are plenty of other developments which are happening on greenfield sites where CPOs are planned to be used by National Grid to plough up farming fields used for food but also tree production as well.
Would you like to apologise?
Yes, of course. Fujitsu has apologized.
Does the taxpayer get a good deal from private firms like Fujitsu? And we start today with house prices. Let's have a look at this headline in this morning's Financial Times. UK house prices fall at fastest pace in more than a decade. Is that a good or a bad thing, Stephen?
Well, it's a bad thing, but I read that article very carefully. And actually what it points out is those are prices that were 3 or 4 months ago. And actually, if you look at what the article says, it now says because we've started to see, although mortgage rates are obviously higher than they were 2 years ago, starting to come down from the top. I see that in that article also the agents say they're expecting an expansion of sales this year, and also they're expecting that they're going to see the bottoming of the house price fall. That's good. Of course, people don't want to see house prices fall, but we do need to do other things to make sure that we actually are offering people the chance to have their own homes. And it's not just about mortgages and demand, it's about supply as well. And in London, of course, we have a mayor who's not building enough homes.
Wendy.
So I think what's interesting about this headline here is that headline is predominantly driven by reports in terms of falling house prices in London, whereas in Scotland, obviously I represent a Scottish constituency, we saw prices fall. And I think the challenge here is, as Stephen has said in relation to supply, that so many more people find that they can't get on to the housing ladder. And there is a real challenge for renters, because one of the challenges of rising house prices is it means that rents go up, and that makes it even more difficult for people to get onto the housing ladder.
The article also mentions the shortage of rental properties. Paul, good or bad thing?
Well, it's not very. It's good if you're a young person looking to get on the housing ladder, and therefore, you know, I mean, the economics editor, former economics editor in me, just reminds me to say the maximum fall that we're looking at here from peak to trough is 5% of prices. This is why it's happening, because the mortgage market locked up last year because the fixed rates people were being offered were high. So we got to the end of the year and people started to unload this. They started to knock, 30, 50 grand off the price of houses that we're trying to sell to get rid of them. They're still not moving, and I think what we will see in the early part of this year is it will carry on falling. But at the end of the day, as others have said, it's not the sort of 5% fall from peak to trough in house prices isn't going to sort out the acute problem of housing need that we have in this country. Renters being hammered by onerous conditions, shortage of rental properties now. We need more council houses, and Labour's going to build them.
Anaya, good or bad thing?
I mean, Paul is absolutely right. I mean, obviously nobody wants the price of their homes to collapse, and that's not what we're seeing. But when you think about it from an under 35 perspective, they are locked out of the housing ladder, paying exorbitant rents when they're essentially forced to live in cities, because that's where so many of the opportunities are. And the rising house prices are increasing far higher than wages. So even if you have a small dip, the income multiples, the amount that people need to have times in order to actually get on the housing ladder, is huge, on top of the amount of a deposit. So so many politicians constantly come on these shows and talk about we need to build more homes, but we're just not seeing the reality. And on top of that, we have a population increasing of hundreds of thousands per year. The rhetoric just does not meet up with the reality that so many young people cannot get on the housing ladder, and then that also prevents them from starting a family, because are you going to have 2 kids in a 1-bed flat?
Yeah,
it's just not
certainly
acceptable.
a very difficult situation. We are going to move on now and talk about the Prime Minister's flagship Rwanda policy. He finally succeeded in getting the bill through the House of Commons last night, the 3rd reading, after the Tory rebellion failed to materialise. So it's through. Stephen, when are the planes going to take off?
Well, I don't know. I mean, obviously the bill is going to go through the Lords, but I suspect if they're going to take off at all, it's going to be in the second half of the year. But this isn't as much. I have always viewed this bill as much about actually saying we want to stop illegal migration. It's part of that. I've always consistently said that I think we should divorce illegal migration from economic migrancy from asylum. And what we want to concentrate on is making sure that people who should be coming here because we need them for economic reasons or others aren't being forced out by people jumping the queue or people being exploited by criminal gangs.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a probably broad agreement on most of those points. You voted for this last night. You said you think the second half of the year. Are you pleased about that? Is that a good thing?
Well, I've said on this programme before to other presenters, and I'll say it again to you, I see this as just part of what the government's trying to do to stop illegal gangs. I spoke to the Chancellor, the Lord Chancellor, and to the Attorney General to ensure that the bill was within our legal obligations and remains so. Any amendment would have been impossible. And I guess what I'm saying to my colleagues in the Conservative Party is, yes, absolutely we want to stop illegal migration, but equally we want to start talking about economic growth, jobs, cutting the waiting lists as well. And a divided party never wins. And they've got to learn that actually, it may not have been perfect and people like me may not have liked all of it, but we did it because we want to stop illegal migration and I want to start talking about things.
So you held your nose then when you voted for it?
Well, I said to you, I spoke to the Attorney General, I spoke to the Lord Chancellor. I see it as part of our plan against illegal migration. After all, the Albania Treaty has been extremely successful. If we can look at similar deals like that, that might well equally stop illegal migration and stop the boats.
It would seem the assurances that you have been given by the Lord Chancellor are the very things that are worrying those on the right of your party, aren't they?
Yes, but the Prime Minister has said that he would not accept any amendment that took the bill in breach of our international obligations, nor would he accept any amendment that would have actually said the Rwandans say they wouldn't have done the deal. And what was clear last night was that or yesterday and the day before, was those amendments would have made the bill impossible.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that. I'll come to the rest of the panel in a moment, but I just want to play you now a clip of James Cleverly in the House of Commons. This is what he had to say about the legality of the bill.
As drafted, as we intend this bill to progress, it will be in complete compliance with international law. The UK takes international law seriously, and the countries that we choose to partner with internationally also take international law seriously.
And contrast what the Home Secretary James Cleverly said there in the House of Commons with what is actually written on the front of the bill. We can see that now, I think, on your screens. I am unable to make a statement that, in my view, the provisions of the Safety of Rwanda Bill are compatible with the Convention rights, but the government nevertheless wishes the House to proceed with the bill. I mean, he would appear to be contradicting himself.
But I think that statement is made and has been made before when it's not clear that potentially other people might view it in a different way. But you heard what he said. And I said I've already spoken to the Lord Chancellor and the Attorney General and a number of other lawyers, and I am convinced that this bill, as currently drafted, I wouldn't accept any amendments that take us outside our international obligations.
The drafting hasn't changed. As currently drafted, that's the foreword to it, as it were, and it seems to completely contradict what the Home Secretary said in the House of Commons.
No, but I'm saying to you that you've seen that wording on the front face of bills before. That wording is to cover the Home Secretary if someone in another court somewhere else takes a different view on it. What he said in the House of Commons at the dispatch box, as you know, is government policy. And I think he's right to say that.
OK, Wendy.
I mean, I don't accept that just because we've seen it on the front of the bill of previous bills that we should accept that a breach of international law is in any way acceptable and just shrug our shoulders. But your original question was whether you think the flights will take off, and Stephen's given us a different opinion from every other Conservative MP that we've heard on the airwaves in recent days. And indeed, Lord Cameron yesterday said that he couldn't guarantee that it would be by the election, which we obviously expect in the second half of the year. So we're in this position where this was supposed to be emergency legislation. The government couldn't get it through before Christmas because of how riven the party was. They've now succeeded in getting it through the House of Commons. But this argument from the Prime Minister that this is therefore then the will of the people and the House of Lords should roll over and not properly scrutinise legislation is frankly just pure populism.
Well, the Prime Minister was asked, he gave a press conference this morning on this, and he was asked when will the flights take off. This is what he had to say.
So we're working as fast and as quickly as we can. And the question really is for the House of Lords, right? And that's the question is, will the House of Lords understand the country's frustration, see the will of the elected House and move as quickly as we have to support this legislation so we can get it on the statute books and then get flights up and running. And as I said previously, we're already doing the operational work that's required to make sure that we can get flights up.
He not entirely clear, Naya, was he?
Well, I mean, it looks like the Prime Minister is essentially trying to hope, in a way, that the House of Lords scupper the bill so that he can go to the electorate and say, look, I did everything I could, and the House of Lords were the ones that prevented it. But fundamentally, this is a question about who runs this country. And every poll across age groups and across political parties show that the majority of the country want immigration to come down. We have a de facto open border when it comes to the small boats issue. And the fact that many people are clearly economic migrants, we have a higher rate of accepting people as refugees than other countries in Europe. There is clearly a lot of exploiting going on and a lot of abusing of the system. And what I would like to see is actually the UK champion internationally potentially an amendment to these international human rights laws. They were drafted in the 1960s. A lot has changed since then, and many countries are concerned about the way in which the asylum system is being abused and mass migration. And I do think that this is a really huge electoral issue. I mean, these political parties can avoid it, but the small boats crisis is a huge concern for the public. And if we consistently see that we can't do anything about it, that is terrible for democracy.
Paul, Anaya's right, isn't she? I mean, let's look at this tweet from my colleague Simon Jones here on Twitter, now X. 358 migrants on 8 boats were brought to Dover yesterday in freezing conditions on the day the Rwanda Bill passed its latest hurdle in the Commons.
It won't work. It's unfair. It's in breach of international law. It's horrendously expensive. It's eroding the separation between the executive and the courts, and it's making us a pariah country.
How do we deal with small boats?
That's what this is about, the bill, OK? Now, when I think about will the planes take off, the first thing I think about is the people who are going to be dragged onto those planes, if they can find a company prepared to do it, chained to the floor, probably protesting and under extreme stress. How do we know this? Because that is what happened to one of the few people it was done to. And when your constituents in Wimbledon and yours in North Fife see that happening to people when they land in Rwanda and tell the story, I don't think the general problem that British people have about migration's too high does translate into inhumanity towards individual people. And let me just say one other thing. Let's say one other thing.
Should we stop deportation?
Fortunately, we have a thing in this country that tells us whether or not whether or not a law is in breach of international law. It's called a court of law. And I hope this bill will be tested, because that Cleverly statement is contradictory, and any judge who's prepared to consider it must begin there. The government itself does not guarantee that this is in concordance with international law.
I think we have to be really proportionate. Britain has been at the forefront of human rights legislation for decades. This kind of framing of the UK as this kind of despotic pariah that's going to do all of these inhumane, horrific things, that's not what is happening here. Actually, the reality is that many of the people, through the small boats crisis are being exploited by criminal gangs. They're going into the underground economic market and have very little protections and are actually victims here as well. It is for the safety of people to not take an extremely dangerous journey, to have a deterrent that prevents people from crossing the channel.
But surely Simon Jones's tweet there demonstrates that it's not a deterrent. Rwanda isn't a deterrent for people because they've come so far, and the lack of safe and legal routes for people to come so that their asylum claims can be heard and processed quickly and returned if they needed to. There are many legal
routes. We have for Afghan interpreters, we have legal routes for Syrians, we have thousands of Hong Kong people arrive similar with Ukrainians. This idea that we haven't been accepting people is just not true.
Should an Afghan person be put on a plane to Rwanda?
Well, I think we have to assess their specific...
Should a Somali person be put on a plane to Rwanda?
Look, there are many horrible things...
Should a person
Hold on, let me answer your question.
Yeah,
there are many horrible things going on in the world. I think nobody here will deny that. The question is whether Britain can necessarily accept all of the very thousands and hundreds of thousands of claims that exist. We have to do something.
And the point here, and I disagree with Paul, first of all, I don't think this bill is in breach of our international obligations. And secondly, we have to do something. It's unfair. What is unfair is all the illegal immigrants coming in, which are potentially overriding the interests of people who we should be giving asylum to and people who we really want for economic migrancy. And that's the key point. And I think that things we've already seen, like the Albanian treaty, which has had huge success, 90% less illegal immigrants coming from Albania, things like that combined with this, I mean, it may not be a deterrent yet, but I suspect it's all part of that package that I was talking about earlier. And that's what we need to do. Stop the criminal gangs. Stop exploiting these people. If these people have a right to come here through asylum, there are safe and legal routes, and they should be using those. If we want people to come here, as we certainly do for economic migrancy, let's set that out and let's make that clear. There's as we know, there's the exempt professions and shortages, occupations routes that people come in on. Let's make sure we have those right and reflect the needs we want. But let's stop illegal migration.
OK, well, clearly, listening to both Wendy and Paul, you're not fans of this bill. Should the Liberal Democrat and Labour Lords be trying to frustrate it when it now moves to the second chamber?
The job of the House of Lords is to scrutinise legislation. And I think what's important to note here is the House of Lords can actually dedicate the time that's needed to scrutinise, because in the House of Commons, the government are in charge of the time. So we're in this position where we've had 2 days of debate, committee of the whole House, and a third reading, where we've never actually got properly into the nuts and bolts of the bill. So and that's what Lords should be doing.
So they'll be scrutinising it, but not attempting to block it.
Well, obviously there's the convention that means that the Lords eventually, in terms of the elected House, but what that doesn't mean is that the Lords shouldn't be looking to make amendments that they believe will improve the bill.
Of course the Lords should scrutinise it, and they should scrutinise it properly. But to say the House of Commons didn't, when on Tuesday we didn't even use all the time that was available for scrutiny because people didn't want to scrutinise it, shows that the House of Commons had plenty of time to do it. If it had wanted more time and we'd used up all that time, that argument would have held, but it didn't hold. And quite rightly, of course, the Lords will scrutinise it. Of course, they'll bring it back. That's part of their constitutional right.
And if they bring back amendments which further reassure you in terms of being in line with international law, would you sign up to those amendments?
Well, I'll look at those amendments closely. As you know, I've made it very clear all the way through that I won't support anything that breaches international law, or the Attorney General or the Lord Chancellor have given me assurances that this does, and I'm prepared to listen to those, and I'll listen to what they say about amendments.
OK. Paul, how far should the unelected members of the second chamber go in trying to frustrate this bill?
It's a secondary issue. There won't be any planes taking off before the election if the election's in November. And what I hope, and I don't speak for Labour, I'm a mere member of the Labour Party, I hope that Labour will just say simply, we will repeal this bill, and this act when it becomes an act, and then Paul Kagame and his authoritarian government in Rwanda can decide what to do about that, because it will kill the whole thing dead. The whole thing is a circus staged by the Conservative Party to demonstrate its own racism to 12% of the electorate who are voting and polling for Reform UK, while the rest of us want to get on with making this country a liberal and a tolerant and a humane place for people seeking asylum from some of the worst things that can happen to a human being.
I also want this country to be a sanctuary for people experiencing some of the worst things. Many of the people on the small boats sadly are not those people. And I think actually many countries liberal countries that I presume Paul would like, Germany and also the Netherlands, are looking very closely at the Rwanda Bill if it succeeds, because they actually are interested in potentially emulating the policy if it succeeds. But I actually, on this point, think that it probably won't, sadly.
Yeah. Can I get you to respond to the point that Paul made there, the idea that this is Rishi Sunak trying to demonstrate to 12%, I think you said, of the population?
12% today, Reform UK, YouGov poll.
What's your response to that?
One-word response is nonsense. Of course it's not to that. You set out this when Reform were on 1%. It's nothing to do with that. This is about ensuring that we stop illegal migration, so that, as we rightly say, we continue the tradition that we offer asylum and refugee to people who need it because they're being persecuted for their political, religious or sexual beliefs or other beliefs. We continue to do that as a country, and we should continue to do that as a country, and we must continue to do that as a country. It's nothing to do with that. This is about stopping the illegal migration, the exploitation by criminal gangs.
OK, all right, watch this space. We'll be back on that one, I'm sure. We're going to move on now and talk about infrastructure, pylons specifically. We're going to hear now from the former Environment Secretary, Therese Coffey. She asked a question in PMQs yesterday with regard to plans by the National Grid in her particular part of East Anglia. Let's listen to that.
There are plenty of other developments which are happening on greenfield sites where CPOs are planned to be used by National Grid to plough up farming fields used for food but also tree production as well, when there are brownfield sites already available connected to the network. National Grid is refusing to publish its study of Bradwell and why they deem it would not be suitable for this connection of offshore wind farms and interconnectors.
OK, Therese Coffey there, enjoying the freedom of the backbenches to ask that question in PMQs. Listening to that was Rosie Pearson, who's a founder of the campaign group Essex, Suffolk, Norfolk Pylons, which opposes National Grid's plans for the pylons. Thanks very much for joining us, Rosie. We appreciate it. So can you explain why you are against the pylons?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, firstly, as Therese Coffey says, there is a better way of doing things, and brownfield sites for landing points for the North Sea offshore wind is one of the big things that National Grid needs to look at. With regards to the pylons themselves, it's old technology for a 21st century problem. We need a great grid upgrade. We need the offshore wind. None of us dispute that, but it's how it's connected that's the problem. The pylons, they result in habitat destruction. Birds fly into power lines and die. The heritage and beautiful landscapes of East Anglia are ruined forever. So what we're saying is we're not averse at all to the great grid upgrade, but it needs to be via an offshore grid which integrates the power offshore and brings it on via the brownfield sites that Therese Coffey mentioned.
Paul.
Well, the government issued last year a quite good, I say this as a Labour person, quite good national policy statement that basically said we are in such trouble over our ability to achieve a net zero energy system that we're going to have to basically say that anything that promotes net zero, anything that's renewable, anything that connects the offshore wind farms to the grid is going to be presumed to get planning permission and not going to be allowed to go through a load of stalling tactics by communities who quite rightly feel aggrieved by this. And I back that. I think that was a good move by the government. But we now know that this is the kind of trouble that it's going to run into. You know, there's no way of greening the energy system without building a lot of pylons. Cables underground are 6 to 10 times more expensive. There are better looking pylons. There's better wire you can put in them. But in the end of the day, I think we just have to try and take a view that we have to invest in the green energy infrastructure. Otherwise, all the electric cars and the kettles people are boiling there, and they're heating their homes this morning, they won't be able to do it.
OK, Rosie, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I agree with there is that there are better cables that we could use to reconduct the entire system. And in fact, National Grid itself owns a company that produces cables that allow you to transmit 5 times more power through the system. So everyone, including Labour, fixates on building pylons as the only solution. But as I said, pylons are yesterday's technology. We can reconduct the whole system with faster technology, and an offshore grid is faster, it is cheaper, and it is better. So anyone that says, including the national policy statements, that pylons are the only way forward is not looking at the big picture and isn't thinking about consumers. It's cheaper to do things a better way than to carry on the old-fashioned way.
Paul, do you want to respond to that?
I think let's do the best we can. I mean, this is the point, isn't it? There's always going to be trade-offs between communities, energy providers. The cost thing is important, though, because everyone's having a go at the moment. The Tories are having a go at Labour for promising to spend 28 billion a year on greening the infrastructure and greening the energy and the steel system. Now, the private sector say to us, actually, you don't need to spend that much. We could spend it. We'll invest. Why? We'll invest if you can give us what they call regulatory certainty. That is, if you can tell us that we're going to get planning permission for things we need. If you can't give the private sector regulatory certainty, you're going to have to pay a lot of money, and some of that are going to have to be borrowed and taxed out of the economy itself.
OK, Inaya, are you sympathetic to Rosie's position?
Well, I'm sympathetic insofar as I think, communities organising in order to, advocate for what's best for their communities, I think is, something I'm very sympathetic to. But I actually think that a lot of this activism, I just think has the priorities slightly misplaced. I mean, I think the term greenfield site is such a great PR exercise. Actually, if you look at what a lot of the things that are called greenfield sites, they're not this kind of rosy countryside that a lot of us imagine. The reality is that we have huge infrastructure challenges, whether that's housing that we just talked about, our energy infrastructure, our transport infrastructure, and there's been delay and the prioritisation of political expediency over doing what's good for the country. And I think that, sadly, whilst I'm a big animal lover, the fact that some birds might run into this, I don't think is a good enough excuse for what is clearly necessary and important.
Rosie?
What is necessary is to get the best grid and the fastest grid and the cheapest grid so that consumers' bills do not go sky high. What's happening at the moment, National Grid, it only cares about its shareholders. Government doesn't seem to be interested in the offshore grid option. The offshore grid option pools the North Sea wind. It reduces the uncertainty for the wind farm operators. It means that you have a system that's fit for the long term instead of the one at the moment where everything's done in a piecemeal fashion, which is far more expensive and far more damaging. And because it's coordinated, it removes some of the harm to the environment we see with the current approach. So to say that we are coordinating just for our communities is completely wrong. We're coordinating for the best for our country, which is a faster grid and better for the environment and for the communities.
But is it not true to say it would be more expensive? I think the figures National Grid say is that the pylon project would cost $1 billion. To do the offshore system that you were talking about would cost $4 billion. So
National Grid hasn't priced up an offshore grid. There have been 3 independent studies into an offshore grid since 2011, and it's so simple. If you coordinate the infrastructure rather than each wind farm doing its own thing, you reduce the amount of infrastructure overall. That's what brings the cost down. What National Grid is talking about in the figure you've quoted is a project that starts at Norwich, which is nowhere near the coast, and it's a long and convoluted route to get down to London. So it's not an offshore grid. It's not consolidating any infrastructure. It's adding additional infrastructure. So no one, Ofgem isn't helping, National Grid is only interested in its shareholders, and government's got its eyes shut. No one's looking at what's best for the country, which is firstly to integrate into an offshore grid, and secondly to reconductor using modern technology, the existing grid, rather than building new pylons, which are so damaging.
OK. Stephen, Rosie says the government have their eyes closed. Do you think Therese Coffey was right to step in on her constituents' behalf and raise this? Well,
I think the point about community activism is fine and fair, but I think I agree with Paul on this one, actually, that, and I think it's been very clear for a long time, the UK needs to be much clearer about what its long-term strategic aims are for infrastructure. The National Infrastructure Commission has been a great improvement in that. But where we've failed is then translating that into the practical. We actually need a ministry for infrastructure, someone who actually looks at designing, listening to ideas like that about which is the right way for the long term, designing, procuring, contract managing projects and actually implementing them. And then as a country, we'll get better value for money. We'll be able to use the public and the private sector working together. And actually some of the NIMBYism will be overcome as well. But isn't the truth of it, Stephen, that the national aspiration, the good of all that you're talking about, just runs up against communities who don't want particular projects? I mean, even in Wimbledon, in your own constituency, we can see here a City AM headline, London Tory MP, I can tell you they're talking about you, to call for government to block 100 million expansion of Wimbledon's All England club. But you're surely not going to try and actually confuse
No, I mean, that's not an infrastructure project.
With an infrastructure. It's a very different thing.
But it's demonstrative
it's demonstrative of community activity. What it's not demonstrative of is saying, here are national infrastructure needs that actually must overcome local objections.
But surely,
and we must build those for the country.
OK, it's on a much smaller scale, but surely something like expanding Wimbledon creates jobs, doesn't it?
Well, it creates some jobs. It creates some jobs in the summer, yes. And it may well...
in the construction, it
will
creates
create
jobs.
some jobs in the construction industry for a bit of time. It will create, definitely give some jobs in my constituency in the summer. But what it doesn't do is look at other options that were there. And if the All England Club want to come and talk to me tomorrow about the compromise, as I've said for the last 3 months, I'm happy to do that. But that is not the same as looking at national infrastructure priorities.
No.
And the lady there may well be right. Perhaps we should spend a bit more to do the offshore, because that will be better for the longer term.
Right.
But it's because we haven't designed what we need, and we haven't agreed, or we weren't really agreeing the national strategic ambition, that we haven't delivered that.
OK, so Wendy, the Liberal Democrats have certainly used planning in a number of by-elections in recent years. You're not above kind of opposing infrastructure projects when an election is at stake. Where do you sit on this? Are you sympathetic to Rosie, or...?
So I think it's interesting, because I think the National Grid, we are at a crisis point. I've visited tidal wind infrastructure in the north of Scotland, in the Orkneys, for example, and part of the challenge is that we are seeing offshore wind and other projects where simply the length of time it is going to get for them to be connected into the national grid means that it is just not economically viable for projects to be taken forward. And of course, from a net zero perspective, that is really damaging. I think what Stephen said there was right in terms of, National Grid might be saying that it's more expensive to deliver the offshore, but what if that's the right longer-term strategic decision? So that longer-term strategic thinking is part of it. And obviously, Theresa Coffey mentioned in her question to the Prime Minister yesterday was that National Grid were not engaging. And I think when it comes to communities and consultations, I think that's what's really important, because I think if you have a proper consultation and engagement with local communities, you often get to the right outcome.
OK, so do you think this is an appropriate way for an MP to be using their role? To be advocating for one campaign group in their constituency, in their area? Is that appropriate?
Well, I think it's not necessarily about advocating, but it is about raising issues and bringing it to government attention. And if we are seeing that lack of infrastructure, I think it would be right, whether you're a government MP or an opposition MP, to raise that, because again, it's about communities feeling that they're being heard. Is
it the right thing for an MP to be raising it in that way in the House?
I think MPs raise all sorts of issues that their constituents are probably, emailing them about, and she clearly felt that was a really important one. But I think we need to, when it comes to energy infrastructure, we've lost those three priorities, which are abundant, cheap, and I think, and I really think that that abundance and price should really be the kind of guiding principle, and security. And we have had over the last couple of years conflicts in Europe which have highlighted the fact that energy security is a really important priority for our country. And I really do worry about NIMBYism, whether that's for lots of different forms of infrastructure projects that actually prevent our country from getting on the front foot with these issues.
OK, Rosie, I wonder if you want to make a final point before we leave this.
Yeah, it's not NIMBYism to want the best solution, is it? And Theresa Coffey is doing what all MPs should do. She's raising something that's of national importance. In fact, all of our MPs and all the county councils in the region, we all want to see an integrated offshore grid, because all the studies show it's better. So what you've got is National Grid, which isn't a national organisation. It's got shareholders it worries about. They're calling the shots, and that's not the right way to deliver infrastructure.
OK, all right, Rosie Pearson from the campaign group Essex, Suffolk, Norfolk Pylons. Thanks very much for joining us. We appreciate it. We're going to move on now and talk about private companies. Is the taxpayer getting value for money? Let's look at this story from the website Novara Media this week. You can see it there. Free money. Executives at failing train company, they're talking about Avanti, joke about making money at the taxpayer's expense. And one of the quotes from the presentation there, roll up, get your free money here. Stephen, what do you make of this?
Well, I think it takes it back to a point I was making a moment ago, that we in government want to make sure that we have the expertise that we can design and procure and contract manage. And we should also not be afraid of working with the private sector, because the private sector often delivers. So I don't know, I haven't seen that quote. I mean, of course, it is true in the rail industry. The biggest problem is not the TOCs, it's the fact that Network Rail is responsible for 80% of the delays that most of my constituents suffer. So it's a question of making sure that the public and the private sector work together, that, of course, the public sector gets value, but recognising that the private sector often delivers better.
But does the public sector have the expertise to try and get that value? Because when we look at some of these examples, what we're talking about is the public sector apparently not being able to extract that value that you're talking about, or not quite managing it properly. Well,
that's my point. As I said, I've been talking about that for a long time. I mean, we should build the expertise in the public sector so that, for instance, we've just been talking about infrastructure. One of our big problems with infrastructure is we change design halfway through. It costs us a lot more money. Unsurprisingly, the private sector who you've then contracted would say, actually, this is going to cost us a lot more money. If we built the skills in government, which we should do, and we should have learnt by now to do it, and it's across, both when the Labour Party were in power, we were quite good at it for a while, but we've lost that, I think, in a number of areas. If we don't build the skills where the public sector can design, procure and contract management, the taxpayer will lose out. And it will lose out because the public sector is not delivering it if it's building the project, or it will lose out because the private sector hasn't been properly analysed by the public sector.
Paul.
We've got such a huge task ahead of us. We've got to reindustrialise this country. There are so many jobs that could be better jobs. We've got to save the steel industry. We've got to rebuild our defence industry because of what's happening with Russia and Ukraine. And all of these things are going to need private sector involvement. So there's no question about it, but we need some kind of reset of government's relationship to the private sector. If you look at what Joe Biden's been doing in America, it's a bonanza for the private sector. The amount of infrastructure, energy, transport and military spending that's going on there. But what you've got to do is first of all, yes, educate the civil service. I'm quite focused on defence at the moment, and in defence, the MOD, one fiasco after another, and it's all about its inability to manage its relationships with private firms. But if you can get it right, there's a huge upside, because all the countries that do get it right, think about Australia with the submarine building, Germany with its huge car industry, it's not rocket science to get the skills and abilities inside government to manage these contracts. The other thing I'd say as a journalist is about the transparency. So I used to work for Computer Weekly, which broke the story about Fujitsu a long, long time ago. And it's about having the specialist journalists able to just go and look at a contract and say, this is like they've offered to build you a bridge to America, and you've just signed on the dotted line, and that we don't have enough of that.
Should it be up to journalists though to be?
Well, without journalists, I'm afraid, because of the vested interest. I mean, of course, the other problem we have is the revolving door between the civil service and government and the private sector, which makes it very convenient for these contracts to get signed. So journalists, specialist journalists who government have to basically ante up and start answering some of the freedom of information requests that we put in. There's a very important role for journalists and NGOs to just expose these, because those poor post office managers who got completely victimised by the post office could have been saved earlier had some of the journalism been actually listened to by politicians.
And Naya, do you think that the private sector in some cases is kind of taking the public sector for a ride? I mean, those quotes, for those that didn't come across this story, the article I showed at the beginning, this was Avanti West Coast Trains, a leaked presentation from internally, and some of the quotes from that presentation were roll up, get your free money here, referring to the taxpayer, and later on it said, sound too good to be true, question mark. Well, on this occasion it isn't, it's the absolute truth, referring to getting their hands on public money.
Oh no, I mean those quotes are an absolute disgrace, and I think, understandably, with the Horizon scandal, what we saw with P&O Ferries, there is rightly huge scrutiny over certain private companies, and that's why a lot of these people need to be held to account, so that there is a message sent. But I think that Paul's absolutely right, that the private sector undoubtedly does and will continue to play a role, and there's lots of amazing things about that, whether that's entrepreneurship and innovation and just the speed to which they can do things. Yes, train the public sector, but that's
we need more of the private sector, the train sector. I'm agreeing with you entirely. I think you're entirely right.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that, but when it comes to Avanti, I mean, we know with many train services, there's been incredible delays, there's been cancellations, it's extremely expensive, and therefore we definitely need to look at how the kind of terms and conditions of a lot of these contracts, if we're getting proper value for money. And so scrutiny undoubtedly needs to be given, but I don't think we should demonise the private sector.
OK, well, I should say a spokesperson for Avanti West Coast said these slides were an attempt to explain how the service quality regime works to some of our colleagues, but the language used was regrettable. Wendy.
Yeah, I think it clearly was regrettable, and certainly if I think of my colleague Tim Farron, who travels up the West Coast frequently, he's certainly got a lot to say about the delivery of services to Avanti. So I think we've talked a lot here about sort of value to the taxpayer, but I think part of what we have to remember here is also the end customer at the end that's going to benefit from these projects. It's quite clear that the contract aspect, how companies are going to be held to account, we're in the position in relation to Fujitsu. I saw Dan Needle of Tax Associates actually saying that he believes that it may be a case of there is no redress for Fujitsu or no obligation for Fujitsu to compensate victims or the Post Office in any way for their mismanagement because of the way the Post Office continued to lie and didn't actually address the issue with Fujitsu. So if we're in a position where Fujitsu and the Post Office are getting onto the hook and it's all left with the taxpayer, that's just simply appalling.
OK, let's hear from the boss of Fujitsu in Europe now, Paul Patterson from Tuesday.
Fujitsu would like to apologise for our part in this appalling miscarriage of justice. We were involved from the very start. We did have bugs and errors in the system, and we did help the Post Office in their prosecutions of the sub-postmasters. For that, we are truly sorry.
OK, that was the boss of Fujitsu apologising there. Let's hear now from the Lib Dem leader, Ed Davey, who was actually the Post Office Minister for part of this time. Let's hear that clip.
I was lied to on an industrial scale, and of course, I'm sure every other Post Office Minister who was lied to regrets that they were part of this huge conspiracy that the Post Office perpetrated.
Why can't you say sorry?
Well, of course, I feel that I'm right to express regret for not getting to the bottom.
Say sorry. It's the least they deserve. Look what they've been through. Just say sorry for your part in not having got to the answers.
My heart goes out to the hundreds of people who were hit, and I deeply regret that we didn't get to the bottom of the lies that were told.
OK, the Lib Dem leader, Ed Davey there. Wendy, the boss of Fujitsu apologising, contrast that with Ed Davey not really apologising.
Well, I would say that demonstrated there that Ed expressed real regret, and the fact is that he was one of a number of Post Office ministers who the Post Office and Fujitsu did lie to. The other aspect of the committee appearance that Fujitsu made this week was Paul Patterson was unable to explain why Fujitsu had lied for as long as they did. So I think we have to remember that it was 2015 when the whistleblower came forward and 2019 when the High Court case really brought to light what had happened.
But talking about Ed Davey, could he just not apologise as an individual?
But I think you just saw him do that. You just saw him talk about the victims and what has happened to them.
Did he? I mean, it's just, I think there's just a level of kind of empathy. And I think oftentimes politicians will apologise for things that they may not have directly caused, but the part that they played. And when we see just the cruelty that these people experience, I think that there's just a level of empathy that is missing in that interview.
Yeah, and let's be clear. I mean, there was a whistleblower in 2015, but the man who exposed all of this wrote to Ed Davey 4 or 5 times when he was Post Office Minister. And as a previous
Wendy,
minister,
we have to let Wendy come back on that.
And Stephen, he was first. Alan Bates first wrote to Ed 11 days after he became the minister, and he took the guidance not to accept the meeting. But in October 2010, he did meet with him, and he asked the questions of the Post Office and was given answers that we now know were untrue because the Post Office was lying. I'd also point out that post 2015, no Conservative Post Office
Minister
Okay.
met
I would
with
agree
Alan
that the
Bates.
first time you get it. But if
Okay,
as a minister, if you
I'm
get it 3 or
afraid
4
we are
times,
going to have
you know the
to
problem.
we're going to have to leave that there. That is all for today, but Joe Coburn will be back on Monday with more Politics Live at 12:15. Goodbye for now.